Okay, let's get started. Good day, everybody. Welcome to Ready, Set, Go, a webinar series sponsored by HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs known as SNAPS. I'm Mark Allison, and I work at the Center for Social Innovation, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. On behalf of SNAPS, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. Today's webinar is Homeless Programs, Transition Policies, and Changes. I'm pleased to tell you that today's presentation will be given by Diane Schmutzler. Diane has worked on various community development, affordable housing, and policy issues in her last 6 years in CPD at HUD. And since this summer, she's been working with the SNAPS team. As noted on your screen, we also have virtual help desk representatives on the line with us today who will answer your content questions. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I would like to make a few logistical announcements. Today's webinar is a brief one and will last approximately 30 minutes. And as always, it is being recorded. The webinar recording and PowerPoint presentation will be posted next week on the HUD Homelessness Resource Exchange website at www.hudhre.info. We will also send you a brief webinar evaluation at the email address through which you registered for today's webinar. Please respond to the survey so we can get your thoughts on today's presentation as well as future webinars. Next slide, please. As an attendee of this webinar, your microphone will be automatically muted. For better audio quality, we recommend using your phone rather than your computer speakers to listen to today's presentation. Also, due to the large number of attendees, there may be a slight delay in the advancement of some of the slides. If you experience any other technical difficulties, you could try logging off and then logging back in again, and sometimes that helps. If that doesn't work, or if you have any other technical questions or concerns, please request assistance by using the questions box in your GoToWebinar's toolbar. Next slide, please. And that same questions box is also the place where you can submit your content-related questions. And as always, while all of your questions are important to us, due to the volume of questions and the number of attendees, we may not be able to address them all during the presentation itself. Next slide. If we don't get your question, you may submit them to the virtual help desk on the HUD HRE website. When you do so, please remember to reference this presentation, Homeless Programs, Transition Policies, and Changes, when you ask your question. The presentation slides for today's webinar are available at this time if you'd like to follow along. As attendees, you may access these slides by navigating to your chat box in the GoToWebinar toolbar and selecting the URL listed there in the welcome message. Next slide, please. So the objectives for today's presentation: upon completion of today's webinar, you should be able to describe the regulatory requirements of the new CoC program that apply to renewing grants, describe the regulatory requirements of the SHP and Shelter Plus Care programs that will continue to apply upon renewal under the CoC program, and understand what constitutes a substantial grant amendment and the implications of the changes. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Diane to start today's presentation. Diane?
All right, thank you, Mark. And welcome, everybody, to discussing transition policies and changes. So now we'll move into the meat of the presentation. Oh, and next slide. There we go. Starting with a description of the types of projects that may be eligible for certain transition policies or changes. Next slide, please. So in general, awards in effect before August 30th, 2012, that's the date that the CoC program interim rule went into effect. These awards may be renewed to continue ongoing leasing, operations, supportive services, rental assistance, HMIS, and administration. The key word here is ongoing. So these are those elements we're going to talk about for the items that you can continue doing, and we'll be getting to that. Next slide, please. So which projects may be eligible for certain transition policies or changes? So first, we have renewal projects that participated in the SHP and Shelter Plus Care programs. These may be eligible to continue doing certain items. And the second one is renewal projects that participated in the SHP and Shelter Plus Care programs that are eligible even if they would no longer be eligible in the new CoC program. And we'll discuss that more later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So the circumstances for continuing protections for ongoing projects. In order to continue certain items of your program right now, your projects must continue to serve the same population or subpopulation. You must continue to serve the same number of persons in your project, and you must continue to serve the same number of units in the same type of housing. If you have any changes to any of those three items, then that will constitute a substantial amendment to your project. And the items that we will be discussing that you will be able to continue, you will no longer be able to continue if you have a substantial amendment. So understanding the effects of the substantial amendment, so next slide. The effect of a substantial amendment is that all of the new CoC program regulations will apply. We'll also discuss in this presentation all of the CoC program requirements that will apply no matter what. But for the purposes of the items that you can continue doing for the time being, so long as you do not have a substantial amendment, the substantial amendment itself will occur when there's any change, increase or decrease in the number of persons served, if there's any change up or down in the number of units, or any change to the population or subpopulation served. And at that time, things will change and the whole CoC program regulations will apply. And we'll discuss what those are next, but before we do that, I'm going to pass it to Mark for a poll question.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. So we have a number of polls today just to check in with the audience to see how well you're absorbing the information and if you're paying attention. So our first poll today is on your screen now. Which of the following will trigger a substantial amendment? A reduction in the number of units. B, an increase in the number of people served. C, changing the population served. Or D, all of the above. And I'll give you a few seconds to register your vote. Okay, so let's see how we did. So 96% of you got the correct answer, D, all of the above. Wonderful. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much, Mark. I'm very glad to see everybody got that one. So moving on, now we'll get to the meat of this too. When your renewal stays the same, what else can you continue to do? Next slide. So when the renewal project proposes no change to the population, subpopulation, number of person, number of units, or type of housing, then there are basically three things you can continue to do. The first of which is that nonprofits can contract for and make rental assistance payments to landlords and conduct the housing quality standards inspection in permanent supportive housing projects previously awarded under Shelter Plus Care, and you can continue to do so so long as there is no substantial amendment. However, if there is a transition from leasing to rental assistance, then the nonprofit cannot administer it under the new CoC program. The second item that you can continue to do is that even though there are no new safe havens can continue to renew as safe havens so long as there's no substantial amendment. And the third item is related to fair housing. You can continue to apply the Shelter Plus Care and SHP fair housing requirements depending on which program you had been a part of previously. And if you have a question about what that means for your project, you can either reference the regulations that are listed here on the slide, which will tell you what they still had been previously, or please, if you have a specific question for your project, please feel free to submit that to the virtual help desk. So we have these three items about nonprofits, about continuing safe havens, and about fair housing rules. But what happens when the substantial amendment comes in? So next slide. So we have the substantial amendment comes in, and what does that mean? Next slide. That means that all of the new CoC program regulations will apply, as we discussed. So again, the substantial amendment is a change in the number of persons, the number of units, or the population. And what is the effect of having that substantial amendment? Next slide. Next, again. So the change will be, for the first item, that nonprofits cannot administer rental assistance for permanent supportive housing. And the second case is that safe havens may no longer be renewed under the CoC program. And in the third case, for fair housing, all of the CoC program fair housing requirements will be applied. So now I'm going to pass it again to Mark for the next poll question.
Thanks, Diane. So this one might be a little trickier. Let's see here. So the question is, what is the effect of a substantial amendment on a renewal SHP or Shelter Plus Care grant under the CoC program? A, food costs can no longer be covered at all. B, nonprofits can't make rental assistance payments in permanent supportive housing. C, 78.93, that's the fair housing rules, applies to the project. D, security deposits are no longer covered. Or E, B, and C. So go ahead and take a moment to register your vote just by clicking. We'll wait a few minutes, a few seconds here. Okay, let's see how we did. So great, so the correct answer was E, so both B and C. Nonprofits can't make rental assistance payments in permanent supportive housing, and the fair housing rules apply to the project. Diane, did you want to say anything about that?
Well, it looks like people pretty much got it. It was just a question about which two.
Yep.
But I think it pretty much sums up.
Great.
Thank you, Mark.
You bet.
All right. So the next section is related to the CoC program requirements that are applicable to all projects, including renewals, and including renewals with ongoing projects. So even renewals that are still doing some of those three items that are still able to do that because they have no substantial amendment, no changes, these rules will still apply to them. This is what applies to everybody. So basically there are three types, and we're going to go over all three of these. There are three types of costs or activities that we'll discuss. The first is eligible costs that can continue under different budget line items. So basically these are the things that you have been doing that you can continue to do, but just under a different line item. The second is our CoC program requirements that apply to all grants, and these are the things that everyone must do right away. And the third are the CoC program requirements that apply to all grants through attrition, or in other words, the things that apply to grants awarded under the CoC program. But you'll have a little time to complete these changes after the beginning, after the beginning of your operating year. All right, so we've already gone on to the next slide, which is just fine. This is the first one, so we'll stay here, regarding eligible costs that can continue under a different line item. These are items that you can continue to do. They'll just need to be shifted. They'll primarily affect the supportive services and operating budget line items. For our purposes today, we'll only discuss a few of the most common items, but if you would like to determine the budget line item for a specific eligible cost, please reference the CoC Interim Rule Subpart D. Now, to complete the project application and the fiscal year 2012 CoC program, recipients requesting renewal must align their existing budget with the eligible budget line item details as represented on the fiscal year 2012 project application whenever possible. However, there are some identified places where eSNAPs will not be able to accommodate making these changes during application. So don't worry about this too much at the moment. This is good information for you, but for more information about placing the eligible costs in the project application and eSNAPs, please go to the FAQ number 2226 on the HUD HRE. So that again is FHQ number 2226 on the HUD HRE, and that will help guide you through where you can put some of these things. Now, most importantly, the budget line item shifts can be done without triggering a substantial amendment, or without triggering the previous the loss of the previous protections as well. So long as you don't trigger a substantial amendment to your projects in terms of the units or the number of people or the population served. Now, some of the most common examples in this category, as you see on the slide, are food, operating costs for supportive services, and security deposit. Now, food, looking at the first one, used to be an operating cost or a supportive service cost, and now it is supportive service only. The second item is operating costs for supportive service facilities. This used to be eligible as an operating cost, but now these costs are eligible under supportive services. And the last one are security deposits. Security deposits used to be eligible as a supportive service cost, but now they're eligible as leasing or rental assistance cost. However, the ESNAP systems can't accommodate the line item precisely, so it will be important for you to review the additional information in another FAQ, which is number 2150 on the HUD HRE. And that's also summarized on the slide about the basic idea of where things will be needing to go. So again, the FAQ for this is 2150. Next slide, please. So now we're in the second group, the CoC program requirements that are applicable to all grants right away. So with the match is the first one. This will be applicable right away. It's 25% match, cash or in-kind on all costs except leasing. And the second is our housing quality standards. The housing quality standards applies to all housing assistance. And the third are the timeliness standards, that these are located at 578.85. Now, this is pretty consistent with what it had been, but the biggest change here is that funds must be distributed to subrecipients within 45 days. Next slide, please. Right, additional CoC program requirements that are applicable to all the grants are program fees. The program fees are no longer allowed. Projects may no longer charge program fees, and they must stop charging program fees. And the fifth item in this category are the record-keeping requirements. So recipients and subrecipients must follow all confidentiality, record retention, and record-keeping requirements. Next slide, please. All right, now the third category that I described are CoC program requirements that are applicable through attrition. In this case, the CoC program regulations will apply to all grants awarded in the fiscal year 2012 CoC Program Competition. However, we understand that it will be difficult to transition to the new requirements right away due to the nature of the activity. These are things that take a little while. Therefore, you will have some time after the start of your program operating year to become fully compliant. But you must begin applying the standards through attrition, which we'll describe here. So then the first case, the location of rental assistance. The CoC program regulation requires that tenant-based rental assistance must stay within the CoC's geographic boundaries. We realize that in the past, in some communities, tenant-based rental assistance was provided outside of the CoC's geographic boundaries. We do not expect nor want you to terminate anybody's rental assistance who resides outside of CoC's geographic boundaries. But when that person exits the program, they've finished up and they're exiting the program, then the unit that replaces theirs must be within the CoC's geographic boundaries. Now in the second case, talking about leases and occupancy requirements, the CoC program regulation requires that leases, subleases, or occupancy agreements are in place for all program participants in permanent housing and transitional housing. HUD recognizes here again that coming into compliance with this requirement will take some time. Recipients will have some time to come into compliance, but HUD expects all recipients to be in compliance with this regulatory requirement before applying for your next renewal. So that is actually pretty much covers everything we wanted to discuss, and I'm going to pass it to Mark with the next two poll questions.
Thank you. So the first one here, you'll see on your screen, the 25% match requirement only applies to renewals if a substantial amendment is completed. Is that true or false? Okay, let's see how we did. Wonderful. So the correct answer is false, 96%. Top notch. Let's go to the next poll. Renewal projects may continue charging program fees unless a substantial amendment is completed. Is that true or false? Okay. Excellent. 97%. False is the correct answer. That's remarkable. Wonderful. Okay. So this was a brief presentation, as we stated. I wanted to thank you to Diane.
Thank you, Mark, too.
This is the end of our webinars. So what we had hoped to accomplish is that by now you should be able to describe the regulatory requirements of the new CoC program that apply to renewing grants, describe the regulatory requirements of the SHP and Shelter Plus Care programs that will continue to apply upon renewal under the CoC program, and understand what constitutes a substantial grant amendment and the implications of the changes. Next slide, please. So thanks everybody for taking the time to attend today's presentation. For those of you who've joined us the last several webinars, you've noticed that we are doing shorter, more targeted presentations. And so we would like your feedback on what you think of that format. So please do remember to complete the online survey. Also, we're excited to begin offering attendees of this webinar and all future webinars for the Ready, Set, Go series the ability to mark this course as complete in the new learning management system so that you can add it to your learning transcript and track your learning over time. And you'll receive a link via email to complete both of these later today. Next slide, please. So just one more time as a reminder, if you did submit a question that we weren't able to answer during the presentation today, please be sure to submit it through the virtual help desk. Keep an eye on the HUD listservs for future webinars, which we'll be having. Thanks once more to Diane, and thanks to all of you. And on behalf of SNAPS, enjoy the rest of your day.